Somewhere right now, a foreign intelligence agency is copying your government's most sensitive secrets. Not stealing them in the traditional sense, copying them. Encrypted files, sealed tight, completely unreadable. And here's the strange part. They don't care that they can't read any of it yet. They're patient. They're betting on a machine that doesn't exist yet, one that will eventually turn today's uncrackable code into an open book. The Pentagon has a name for this waiting game: harvest now, decrypt later. And in the summer of 2026, for the first time in its history, the United States military looked at this threat and called it something it almost never calls anything: existential. That word matters. The Department of Defense does not throw it around casually. It has been used for nuclear weapons. It has been used for climate change. And now, for the first time, it has been formally attached to a technology that most people still associate with science fiction: quantum computing. Not the version of quantum computing you hear about in vague headlines promising faster drug discovery or smarter financial models. This is quantum computing as a weapon aimed directly at the digital backbone of the American military. To understand why the Pentagon is suddenly this alarmed, you have to understand what modern military security actually rests on. Almost everything the Department of Defense does depends on encryption. Nuclear command and control, submarine communications, satellite links, battlefield coordination between troops in active combat zones, diplomatic cables, intelligence sharing with allies. All of it is protected by mathematical locks, the kind of encryption that, until recently, seemed permanently unbreakable. Not unbreakable because the math is magic, but unbreakable because breaking it would require a computer running for longer than the universe has existed. That has been the quiet assumption underpinning digital security for decades. Break a 2048-bit encryption key, and you'd need more time than the sun has left to burn. Quantum computing threatens to collapse that assumption entirely. Here's the core problem explained without the jargon. Ordinary computers, the ones we all use, process information as bits. A bit is either a 0 or a 1. Every calculation your phone or laptop performs happens through long chains of these binary choices, executed at blistering speed but still fundamentally sequential. Quantum computers do not work this way. They use quantum bits, or qubits, which can exist in multiple states simultaneously through a property called superposition. Instead of checking possibilities one after another, a sufficiently powerful quantum computer can explore a staggering number of possibilities at once. For most everyday tasks, this offers no real advantage. But for one very specific category of math problem, the kind that underlies almost all modern encryption, it is potentially catastrophic. The encryption protecting military communications today relies on problems that are easy to create but extraordinarily hard to reverse. Multiply two enormous prime numbers together and you get a huge number almost instantly. Take that huge number and try to figure out which two primes created it without already knowing the answer, and you are looking at a problem so difficult that classical computers simply cannot solve it in any usable time frame. This is the mathematical foundation of RSA encryption, one of the most widely used security systems in the world, protecting everything from military networks to your own online banking. In the 1990s, a mathematician named Peter Shor discovered something unsettling. He developed an algorithm, now known simply as Shor's algorithm, that shows how a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could solve this exact kind of problem in a small fraction of the time a classical computer would need. Not slightly faster, exponentially faster. What would take a classical supercomputer billions of years could, in theory, take a large enough quantum computer mere hours or days. The encryption that protects nuclear launch protocols, satellite command links, and classified communications between the Pentagon and its allies could, in a worst-case scenario, be cracked open like a can. The machine capable of doing this at scale does not exist yet. Engineers call the hypothetical device a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, or CRQC for short. Building one is an enormous technical challenge, involving thousands of stable, error-corrected qubits working in concert, something current quantum computers are nowhere close to achieving reliably. Researchers disagree on exactly when such a machine might arrive. Some estimates put it a decade away. Others suggest it could happen sooner, especially as breakthroughs in error correction and qubit stability continue to accelerate. Nobody can say for certain. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes this threat so difficult for military planners to manage. Because here is the twist that turns a future problem into a present emergency. You do not need a working quantum computer today to start attacking encrypted data today. You only need to collect it and wait. This is the harvest now, decrypt later strategy, and intelligence agencies around the world are already believed to be using it. Encrypted military and government data flowing across networks, satellite links, and undersea cables can simply be intercepted and stored, even if it is completely unreadable in its current form. The attacker does not need to break the encryption the moment they capture the data. They can sit on it, sometimes for years, waiting for quantum computing to mature to the point where decryption becomes possible. Once that day arrives, everything harvested during the wait becomes instantly exposed. troop movement histories, diplomatic negotiations, intelligence sources, weapon system specifications. Communications that felt perfectly secure at the time they were sent could suddenly become an open archive for an adversary who simply had the patience to wait. This is why the danger is not abstract or distant. Data being transmitted right now, today, over Pentagon networks, could already be sitting in a foreign server somewhere, waiting for its expiration date on secrecy to arrive. The clock started the moment that data was captured, not the moment quantum computers become powerful enough to read it. Against this backdrop, the Department of Defense released its first ever dedicated strategy focused entirely on this threat. Published in June of 2026, the 25-page document is called the Post-Quantum Cryptography Strategy, and it does not soften its language. It states plainly that the emergence of quantum supercomputing represents an existential threat to national security and to America's global military dominance. Not a risk, not a concern. An existential threat, a phrase reserved for the gravest categories of danger a nation can face. The strategy was released one day after the president signed 2 executive orders aimed at accelerating the federal government's own transition to quantum-resistant security, while also boosting domestic investment in quantum computing research. Together, these actions marked one of the most significant moments in the history of American cryptographic policy, a rare instance of the civilian government and the military moving in lockstep on the same emerging threat in the very same week. The Pentagon's chief information officer opened the strategy with a warning that left little room for ambiguity. She wrote that nearly every deployed military asset would be affected in some way, that adversaries would continue probing for weaknesses, and that significant costs would be incurred along the way. This was not written as a hypothetical scenario buried in an appendix. It was the framing statement for the entire document, a signal that this is being treated as a department-wide emergency rather than a niche technical upgrade. The strategy goes further, specifying exactly where the danger is most severe. It states that insecure communications tied to the rise of quantum computing pose an existential threat, stretching from the authorization and deployment of nuclear weapons to the coordination of joint military operations with allied forces. Read that again. Nuclear weapons authorization systems are explicitly named as part of what is at risk if this transition fails or falls behind schedule. This is not a strategy document worried about leaked emails or compromised supply chains, although those risks are real too. This is a strategy document worried about the integrity of the systems that authorize the use of the most destructive weapons ever built. The specific dangers outlined in the document paint a sobering picture. If an adversary manages to build or access a cryptographically relevant quantum computer before the United States completes its transition to quantum-resistant systems, that adversary could potentially collect and decrypt classified information flowing across terrestrial networks, space-based systems, radio frequency channels, and other military infrastructure. Beyond simply reading secrets, the risk extends to actively taking control of and weaponizing Pentagon systems. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility of adversaries installing unpredictable malware into weapons platforms themselves, or gaining access to command and control systems in an active theater of operations. The consequences described include integrity failures across military networks and a potential loss of what strategists call information dominance, the ability of the United States to control, trust, and act on its own data faster and more reliably than any adversary. So what exactly is the Pentagon planning to do about all of this? The strategy lays out 5 major lines of effort, supported by 8 specific strategic goals, designed to move the entire department toward what officials describe as a quantum-safe future. The first priority is centralizing governance across the Department of Defense, ensuring that this massive transition is coordinated from the top rather than handled piecemeal by individual branches or commands. The second focuses on scanning existing systems for vulnerabilities and building a coherent migration framework, essentially creating a map of where quantum vulnerable encryption currently lives across the military's vast digital footprint. The third centers on developing and refining the post-quantum cryptographic algorithms and protocols themselves, ensuring the mathematical foundations being adopted are genuinely resistant to quantum attacks. The fourth involves integrating secure commercial technology into military operations, recognizing that private industry, from cloud providers to defense contractors, will play a crucial role in this transition. And the fifth focuses on the physical deployment of quantum-resistant devices and infrastructure across military networks worldwide. Timelines matter enormously here, and the Pentagon has set some of the most concrete deadlines in its recent history for a technological transition of this scale. Every Department of Defense system must support post-quantum cryptography, or face being phased out entirely by the end of 2030. By the end of 2031, all systems are expected to be fully operating under the new quantum-resistant standards, unless specifically noted otherwise. These are not soft targets or aspirational goals buried in bureaucratic language. They are treated as binding operational deadlines, the kind that ripple through budgets, procurement decisions, and technical requirements across the entire defense establishment. This transition does not stop at the walls of the Pentagon. It extends deep into the defense industrial base, the sprawling network of private companies that build everything from fighter jets to communication satellites for the American military. The strategy calls for updates to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, the framework that governs how defense contractors must secure their own systems, incorporating new requirements built around quantum-resistant algorithms. In practical terms, this means thousands of companies that supply the military, from massive defense conglomerates down to small specialized contractors, will eventually need to overhaul their own cybersecurity infrastructure to remain eligible for military contracts. Industry experts have already raised concerns about how prepared or unprepared that contractor base actually is. Many companies are still catching up to earlier waves of cybersecurity certification requirements and now face the prospect of layering an entirely new, highly technical cryptographic overhaul on top of existing obligations. Legal and cybersecurity specialists tracking this shift have noted that while the Pentagon has not yet finalized exactly how or when it will begin enforcing these new quantum-related requirements, the direction of travel is unmistakable. Post-quantum cryptography is coming to military contracting, and companies that fail to adapt risk losing access to a massive and lucrative segment of the federal marketplace. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how large this technical challenge actually is. This is not simply a matter of installing new software updates across military networks. Post-quantum cryptographic algorithms behave differently than the encryption systems currently in place. The digital certificates and cryptographic keys involved in these new standards are often significantly larger, in some cases up to 10 times the size of their older counterparts. That difference might sound trivial, but at military scale, across satellites, embedded weapon systems, communication hardware, and legacy infrastructure that was never designed with these larger keys in mind, it creates real engineering headaches. Bandwidth constraints, compatibility issues, and hardware limitations all become obstacles that need to be solved, tested, and validated before this transition can be considered complete. Some of the oldest systems in the military's arsenal were simply never built with this kind of cryptographic flexibility in mind, meaning parts of this transition will require not just software changes, but physical hardware replacements. The algorithms themselves are not experimental guesses thrown together at the last minute. They are the product of an extraordinarily long and rigorous evaluation process led by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Researchers spent roughly 8 years evaluating candidate algorithms submitted from cryptographers around the world, narrowing down more than 80 initial submissions through relentless testing, peer review, and attempted attacks designed to break them. That process culminated in the summer of 2024, when the agency finalized its first set of official post-quantum cryptography standards. The primary standard for securely establishing encryption keys is built on a mathematical structure called learning with errors. Unlike the prime number problems that Shor's algorithm can defeat, this lattice-based approach relies on a completely different kind of mathematical difficulty, one that, as far as current research shows, has no known efficient solution even for quantum computers. It essentially trades one type of hard math problem for a different type of hard math problem, one specifically chosen because quantum computers appear to offer no meaningful shortcut against it. This is important context, because it explains why officials are confident that a solution exists, even while acknowledging how difficult implementing that solution will be. The mathematics of post-quantum cryptography has already been tested extensively by the global cryptographic research community. The challenge from here forward is not theoretical. It is almost entirely about execution, about physically rebuilding and recertifying an enormous, complex, decades-old technological ecosystem before an adversary manages to build the machine capable of breaking the old one. And that brings us to the geopolitical dimension of all this, because the United States is not operating in isolation here. Other nations, including strategic rivals, are pouring enormous resources into quantum research, both for the immense scientific and commercial potential of the technology, and, more pointedly, for its military applications. American defense officials have made clear that they view this as a race, one where falling behind carries consequences far more severe than losing a normal technological competition. In past technology races, being second often meant losing market share or economic advantage. In this race, falling behind could mean waking up one day to discover that decades of encrypted secrets, military plans, source identities, and command infrastructure have all become simultaneously readable by an adversary who got there first. State-sponsored research programs in rival nations have made quantum computing a declared national priority, backed by levels of government funding and long-term planning that rival, and in some assessments exceed, what the United States has historically invested in the field. Intelligence officials have repeatedly warned lawmakers that adversarial nations are not simply matching American research, they are actively positioning themselves to be the first to cross the threshold into a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, precisely because whoever gets there first gains a temporary but enormous strategic advantage. For a window of time, potentially years, the first nation to build a working machine capable of breaking modern encryption would hold the ability to read the secrets of every other nation still relying on classical cryptography, while its own systems, already migrated to quantum-resistant standards, remained protected. That asymmetry, having the key while everyone else is still using the old lock, is precisely the scenario the Pentagon's strategy is designed to prevent the United States from ever facing. This is why Allied cooperation has become such an important thread running alongside the domestic rollout. Coordination with treaty partners on shared communication standards, joint military exercises, and intelligence sharing arrangements all depend on compatible cryptographic systems. If the United States migrates to quantum-resistant standards while key allies lag years behind, or vice versa, it creates friction and vulnerability at exactly the seams where coalition operations most need seamless, trusted communication. Getting the timing right is not just a domestic technical challenge, it is a diplomatic one as well, requiring the kind of coordinated planning across borders that rarely moves as fast as engineers would like. This is part of why the Pentagon's language has shifted so dramatically. Previous cybersecurity strategies tended to speak in terms of risk management, resilience, and layered defense. This strategy speaks in terms of survival. The framing throughout the document treats quantum computing not as one threat among many in a crowded field of cyber risks, but as a threat capable of unraveling the very foundation that all of those other defenses are built upon. If encryption itself becomes breakable at scale, many of the other cybersecurity protections the military has spent decades building become far less meaningful, because the locks they were designed to reinforce will no longer function as intended. The price tag attached to all of this is staggering, even by Pentagon standards. Government estimates put the cost of migrating federal systems to post-quantum cryptography somewhere in the range of several $billions over the coming decade, and that figure covers only the publicly known portion of the effort. Classified national security systems, the ones tied most directly to intelligence gathering and nuclear command, are being assessed separately, with their own dedicated cost projections still being finalized. Every one of those dollars has to be justified, budgeted, and defended in front of Congress, which is part of why officials needed language strong enough to compete with every other funding priority the Pentagon juggles in a given year. Existential threats get funded, routine maintenance items do not. It also helps to understand that the military did not arrive at this moment from a standing start. Long before this new strategy existed, the National Security Agency had already begun quietly pushing parts of the defense establishment toward quantum-resistant systems through an earlier framework covering the most sensitive national security networks. New acquisitions tied to classified systems were already expected to meet quantum-safe requirements by the start of 2027, years before this broader department-wide strategy was even published. In some sense, this new strategy is less a sudden invention and more a formal public acknowledgement of a shift that specialists inside the intelligence and defense community had already been preparing for behind closed doors. Private industry is racing on a parallel track, and the comparison is revealing. Some of the largest technology companies in the world, the same companies that build the cloud infrastructure much of the federal government quietly relies on, have set their own internal deadlines for completing this transition, in some cases even earlier than the government's own targets. That should tell you something about how seriously the private sector is treating this shift. When companies with enormous engineering resources and no legal obligation to move quickly choose to accelerate their own timelines anyway, it is a strong signal that the underlying threat is being taken seriously well beyond the walls of the Pentagon. There is also a broader signal being sent here, beyond the technical details. By using the word existential and by naming nuclear command infrastructure explicitly as part of what is at stake, the Department of Defense is trying to force urgency into a bureaucratic and industrial system that does not always move quickly. Massive technological transitions inside government are notoriously slow, weighed down by procurement rules, legacy systems, competing budget priorities, and the sheer scale of coordinating change across hundreds of agencies, commands, and contractors. Officials appear to understand that soft language produces soft timelines. A strategy document filled with cautious hedging rarely generates the kind of urgent, well-funded, department-wide mobilization that a genuine existential threat requires. Calling it existential is, in part, a deliberate attempt to make sure this transition actually happens on schedule, rather than quietly sliding for years the way so many large government technology projects have in the past. None of this means a catastrophic quantum breach is guaranteed, or even likely, in the near term. The machine capable of breaking modern encryption at scale still does not exist, and building one remains an extraordinary engineering challenge that continues to face significant technical hurdles, from error correction to qubit stability to sheer scale. Serious quantum computing researchers continue to debate how many years away that breakthrough truly is. But military planning has never operated on certainties. It operates on worst-case scenarios and probability-weighted risk, and when the potential downside includes compromised nuclear command systems and decades of harvested intelligence suddenly becoming exposed all at once, even a moderate probability of that outcome becomes something that demands an aggressive, well-funded response today rather than years from now. And what makes this moment particularly striking is the alignment across the entire federal government. The executive orders signed alongside the Pentagon strategy extend similar quantum-resistant deadlines across civilian federal agencies, and additional legislative proposals are already moving through Congress that could push the Department of Defense's own timeline even faster than currently planned. This is not an isolated Pentagon initiative operating in a vacuum. It is part of a much larger, coordinated national response to a threat that spans military security, economic competitiveness, and the basic trustworthiness of digital infrastructure that the entire country, not just the military, depends on every single day. For the average person, all of this can feel distant, abstract, the kind of thing that happens in classified briefings and technical white papers far removed from daily life. But the underlying principle here touches something much broader than military secrets. Encryption is the invisible foundation of trust in the digital world, protecting everything from banking transactions to personal communications to critical infrastructure like power grids and water systems. The same mathematical vulnerabilities the Pentagon is racing to fix apply, in one form or another, across huge portions of the digital economy. When the world's most powerful military looks at this threat and calls it existential, it is not just a statement about tanks, satellites, and nuclear command systems. It is a signal about the fragility of digital trust itself, and a warning that the foundations many industries have relied on for decades are approaching a moment of reckoning. The next several years will determine how this story unfolds. Between now and the end of 2030, the Department of Defense faces the task of rebuilding the cryptographic backbone of the most powerful military on Earth, all while adversaries continue probing for weaknesses and, quite possibly, continuing to harvest encrypted data in anticipation of the day the old locks finally give way. Success would mean a historic, coordinated defense against a threat most of the public barely understands. Failure, even partial failure, could mean that some of the most sensitive secrets in American history were compromised long before anyone realized the breach had already happened. That is why the Pentagon did not bury this warning in a footnote or a classified annex. It put the word existential on the very first page, attached it to nuclear command systems, and gave itself a hard deadline measured in years, not decades. The clock the department is racing against is not ticking toward some distant future. In the harvest now, decrypt later world we already live in, the clock may have started the moment the first encrypted file was quietly copied and tucked away, waiting for the machine that will one day be powerful enough to open it. Whether that machine arrives in 5 years or 15, the strategic logic driving this entire effort remains the same. You do not wait for the threat to fully materialize before building the defense. You build the defense while the threat is still forming, because by the time a cryptographically relevant quantum computer is switched on for the first time, it will already be too late to protect anything that was transmitted before that day. The Pentagon has decided, in the clearest language it has, that this is a race it intends to win, and it has finally said so out loud.